Judge Thomas McAllister sat at the bench, his expression a mask of routine professionalism, as the court session unfolded before him. Years of sitting in this same courtroom, surrounded by the hum of mundane cases and minor infractions, had left him indifferent to most of the proceedings. But today, something felt different. As the door creaked open and a woman stepped inside, McAllister looked up, his gaze briefly lingering on her. She was tall, her posture confident yet calm. Dressed in a sharp, tailored suit, her movements suggested purpose, a quiet intensity that caught his attention. She didn't look like someone who would typically find themselves in his courtroom for a traffic violation. The woman, Dr. Mariah Ellis, held herself with an air of grace that made her stand out, even in a room filled with strangers. As she took a seat, McAllister's mind returned to the case at hand. A speeding ticket. Not unusual for a Tuesday morning. The details were simple. Dr. Ellis had been caught speeding through a school zone. Her attorney had submitted a plea for leniency, but as McAllister glanced at the document, he saw no compelling reason to reduce the fine. She was a professional, clearly, someone who could afford it. He'd seen people like her before, successful, polished, and unbothered by a small financial setback. Dr. Ellis, you've been cited for speeding in a school zone, McAllister began, his voice steady, the words rehearsed. The fine is set at $250. How do you plead? Not guilty, Your Honor, Mariah said smoothly, her voice firm but respectful. There was no hesitation in her words, no panic or fluster. She wasn't fighting the ticket in the usual sense, not claiming an error or offering excuses. McAllister raised an eyebrow. There was something in her tone, a subtle conviction, that told him she wasn't someone who took challenges lightly. Is there any reason you were speeding? He asked, his voice a mix of curiosity and authority. Maria paused for a moment, then answered carefully. I was late for a meeting, Your Honor. I realize that's not an excuse, but I accept the penalty. McAllister nodded, scribbling a note. It wasn't an extraordinary excuse, but it was common enough for someone with a busy schedule. He looked up at her, noticing the faint lines of tiredness beneath her eyes, perhaps from long hours or the weight of responsibility that often comes with professional success. Still, it wasn't his place to judge her life, just her actions. The fine is $250, he said, his voice now a bit softer. You'll have 30 days to pay it. Maria nodded, standing to leave without protest. Her demeanor was unshaken, her focus elsewhere. She gathered her things and left the courtroom, the sound of her heels clicking steadily against the floor. McAllister watched her exit, the image of her calm presence lingering in his mind. He couldn't help but wonder about her, who she was beyond this brief encounter. There was something about her, something intriguing. Something told him that Dr. Mariah Ellis was far more than just another person in his courtroom that day. After the court session ended, Judge McAllister returned to his chambers, his mind still lingering on Dr. Mariah Ellis. It wasn't that the case had been extraordinary, far from it, but there had been something about her calm, almost effortless composure that stood out. Most defendants in his courtroom seemed anxious or defensive, but she had carried herself with an air of quiet authority. It intrigued him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her than just a traffic violation. A few hours later, after clearing a pile of paperwork, McAllister found himself absent-mindedly typing her name into a search engine. He wasn't sure what he expected, but what he found was nothing like he anticipated. His eyes widened as he scrolled through the results. Dr. Mariah Ellis wasn't just some successful businesswoman or lawyer. She was a leading expert in disaster management, a pioneer in the field of public administration, and her work was starting to make waves at the federal level. One headline caught his eye. Dr. Mariah Ellis to head Federal Disaster Response Overhaul Initiative. Intrigued, he clicked on the link. The article detailed her involvement with an ambitious project designed to overhaul the way the federal government responded to national disasters. The initiative focused on modernizing relief efforts, ensuring that aid reached affected communities more efficiently, and prioritizing those who typically fell through the cracks during crisis. People in underserved, often marginalized communities. McAllister leaned back in his chair, stunned. How had he not known this? Dr. Ellis wasn't just a well-dressed woman caught in a minor legal issue. She was a leader, someone who was actively shaping the future of disaster response in America. Her work had already begun to challenge long-established practices and systems, pushing for reforms that could change the lives of millions of people. She had spoken before Congress on the subject, been featured in national media, and worked with multiple federal agencies to improve logistics and outreach during emergencies. Yet here she was, sitting in his courtroom for a simple speeding ticket. The more he read, the more McAllister felt a mix of awe and guilt. He had treated her like just another person in his courtroom, never once considering that this might be someone changing the course of federal policy. He had handed down a fine without a second thought. Was it possible that the woman he had just penalized had done more for her country in a single day than most people did in a lifetime? His curiosity piqued. McAllister decided he needed to learn more. What drove a woman like Maria Ellis? What had led her to become such a force for change? The question swirled in his mind, and he knew this wasn't just about a traffic fine anymore. It was about understanding the person behind the title. Judge McAllister's curiosity about Dr. Maria Ellis grew in the days that followed. He couldn't stop thinking about the powerful articles he had read and the photos of her standing before Congress, speaking with the confidence of someone who had spent years shaping policies that affected millions. He wanted to know more, so he dug deeper into her background. What he found wasn't just an impressive career. It was the story of someone who had overcome immense personal and systemic obstacles to get where she was. Maria Ellis had grown up in one of the most underfunded neighborhoods in the country, a place where opportunities were scarce and resources were even scarcer. Her childhood was marked by financial hardship, and her family faced daily challenges that many others couldn't understand. Her mother had worked 2 jobs to make ends meet, and her father, though loving, had struggled with substance abuse. The community around her was often overlooked by both local and national authorities, a reality that left a lasting impression on Maria as she grew older. It was this early exposure to inequality that sparked her drive for change. From a young age, she was determined to break the cycle of poverty and injustice. She excelled in school, using education as her escape and her weapon. But even as a top student, Maria faced constant hurdles. Being a black woman in predominantly white academic spaces often meant being underestimated, her intelligence questioned at every turn. She had to work twice as hard to prove herself, and she often found her ideas dismissed without consideration. Despite this, Maria persevered. She completed her undergraduate degree in record time and went on to earn her Ph.D. in public administration, specializing in disaster management. Throughout her academic journey, she encountered mentors who believed in her, but she also encountered prejudice, subtle, pervasive, and often hidden behind smiles and polite conversation. It was frustrating, but Maria had grown used to the fact that she would always have to fight harder than others to be taken seriously. As her career progressed, Maria's work in disaster management began to gain attention. She was invited to collaborate with government agencies and nonprofit organizations, eventually helping to design a more effective and equitable federal disaster response system. But even in these prestigious circles, she was often the only black woman in the room, and her ideas were sometimes met with resistance. Some saw her as an upstart, questioning whether her focus on marginalized communities was misplaced. Yet, she refused to let these obstacles derail her mission. The pain of her early life gave her the strength to push forward. McAllister learned that Maria's drive wasn't just about professional success. It was about making sure that communities like the one she had come from would never again be left behind when disaster struck. The more he learned about her, the more he realized how little he truly understood about the systemic challenges people like Maria faced every day. This was no longer just a story about a woman fined for speeding. It was the story of someone who had spent her life fighting for justice, and who, perhaps, deserved far more than a traffic ticket. The story of Dr. Mariah Ellis' traffic ticket quickly caught the attention of local news outlets, sparking a surprising wave of public discussion. For the most part, the incident was nothing more than a minor court case, except now it wasn't. Headlines such as "Renowned Disaster Management Expert Fined for Speeding" and "Is the Justice System Fair to Influential Figures" began circulating, bringing Mariah's name into the spotlight. The contrast between her public stature and the minor offense was impossible to ignore. While most people had no problem with the fine itself, the idea that someone who was helping shape national disaster response could be penalized for something so trivial started to stir questions. Social media platforms were flooded with opinions, and the more people learned about Mariah's work, the more they began to question the fairness of the fine. Some saw it as a symbol of the larger problem: how society often underestimates or dismisses the importance of Black women, especially those who hold positions of power and influence. The public response was mixed, but one sentiment stood out. Many felt the fine was trivial in comparison to her accomplishments. Why, they wondered, should someone who was actively working to change how the government responds to disasters be treated the same way as someone with a completely unrelated minor infraction? Some even argued that she should have been given a pass, not because she was famous, but because of the larger impact she had on society. It wasn't about favoritism. It was about recognizing that sometimes the justice system treats its most powerful agents with the same indifference as it treats everyday citizens. As the story spread beyond local news, it gained traction in broader media circles. National outlets began reporting on it, and soon Mariah found herself being approached by reporters. She was asked about the fine in interviews, but more importantly, the conversation shifted toward her work in disaster management. Her innovations, such as a new model for rapid response logistics and strategies for ensuring equitable distribution of resources during crisis, started to gain more attention. While some reporters focused on the absurdity of the fine, others praised her for her efforts to improve the lives of marginalized communities during disasters. The attention was a double-edged sword for Mariah. On one hand, it gave her an unexpected platform to speak about the issues she cared most deeply about. On the other hand, it reminded her of the double standard that often accompanies her successes. Despite being a leader in her field, she was still subjected to the same rules and assumptions that society imposed on people like her, those who were constantly overlooked, underestimated, and doubted. Judge McAllister followed the media coverage with growing unease. He saw how the public conversation was evolving, and he began to wonder if the fine had been the right decision after all. He had underestimated Dr. Ellis, assuming she was just another defendant in his court, when in reality, she was someone shaping the very policies that would change how his country responded to national disasters. Judge McAllister couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he had misjudged Dr. Mariah Ellis. Over the next few days, as he read more about her work, he found himself increasingly uncomfortable with the way he had handled her case. The fine, though standard in his courtroom, seemed trivial in the face of her achievements. More importantly, the realization that he had failed to recognize her significance began to weigh on him. He had dismissed her without considering the broader context of her life and career. The turning point came when he saw an article in the local paper quoting Mariah, discussing her research on improving federal disaster management. In the piece, she mentioned how important it was to recognize the untold contributions of communities that were often left out of disaster recovery plans. The words echoed in McAllister's mind. We can't keep ignoring the people who need help the most. They should be at the center of our response efforts. He admired her passion and clarity. It was the kind of leadership the nation needed. He felt a strong pull to make things right, not just for the fine, but for the way he had underestimated her. A few days later, McAllister decided to take a step he wasn't used to. He called her office. After a few attempts, he was able to get through to her assistant, who was both surprised and intrigued by the call. A meeting was set up for the following week. McAllister was nervous. He didn't know what to expect or what to say. What could he possibly offer her, other than an apology? When the day arrived, McAllister found himself sitting in the waiting room of a high-rise building in the city's downtown. It was a far cry from the modest courthouse he was used to. Mariah's office was sleek, modern, and full of energy. He was greeted by her assistant, who led him into a conference room where Mariah was already seated, her calm demeanor radiating a quiet authority. "Judge McAllister," she greeted him with a smile, though there was something in her eyes that suggested she knew why he was there. "Thank you for reaching out. Dr. Ellis," he began, taking a seat across from her. "I owe you an apology. After reading more about your work, I realized how much I underestimated you that day in court. I didn't know who you were, or what you've done." He paused, the weight of his words hanging in the air. "I'm not proud of how I handled it, and I wanted to make things right." Maria listened quietly, her expression thoughtful but not judgmental. She had heard apologies before, but this one felt different. She could see the sincerity in his eyes. Still, she didn't rush to forgive him outright. "I appreciate your apology, Judge," she said, her voice steady. "But the truth is, what happened in court was just one moment. There's much bigger work that needs to be done." McAllister nodded, realizing she wasn't looking for a quick fix. She was right. There was a lot more at stake than a single fine, and if he was going to make things right, he would need to listen and learn from someone who had dedicated her life to making real, lasting change. Over the following weeks, McAllister and Mariah began meeting regularly. At first, their conversations were mostly about her work, her ideas, her challenges, and the ways in which she was trying to reshape disaster management in the United States. Mariah spoke with passion about her vision, a system that didn't just respond to disasters but anticipated them, one that placed communities in need at the forefront of recovery efforts. She explained her research, her collaboration with federal agencies, and how she was striving to build a more equitable and efficient disaster response network. For McAllister, it was eye-opening. He had always thought of disaster management in the traditional sense, the logistics, the funding, and the emergency responses. But Mariah's approach was different. She didn't just look at the disaster itself. She looked at the people it affected. She focused on the social inequalities that often made recovery harder for marginalized communities. It was a perspective McAllister had never fully considered. During these meetings, McAllister listened intently, asking questions when he didn't understand and offering insights from his own experiences. The more he learned about her work, the more he admired her dedication and foresight. He began to see her not as the woman who had walked into his courtroom months ago, but as someone who was genuinely shaping the future of disaster relief. Her work wasn't just about improving systems. It was about making the country a fairer, more just place. Despite their differences in background and expertise, McAllister found himself more and more aligned with her goals. He had always prided himself on his belief in justice, but Mariah's work was showing him a deeper, more nuanced version of that principle. Her commitment to ensuring that every community, especially those that had long been neglected, was treated with dignity and respect during crisis resonated with him. As they continued to talk, McAllister opened up more about his own life and career, sharing the doubts and insecurities he sometimes felt about his work. He admitted that, at times, it felt as though the justice system was more concerned with maintaining the status quo than making real progress. Mariah listened, nodding sympathetically. She had felt the same way at times, fighting for systemic change in a world that often seemed more interested in preserving tradition than improving it. They started to bond over their shared frustrations and their shared vision of justice. Mariah spoke of her personal experiences in navigating a system that wasn't always kind to her as a black woman. McAllister, in turn, reflected on the times when he had been complicit in maintaining that system, even unknowingly. Their conversations, once purely professional, slowly deepened into a more personal exchange of ideas and experiences. One evening, after a particularly engaging discussion about the future of disaster recovery, McAllister realized something. He wasn't just learning about Mariah's work. He was learning about his own capacity for growth and change. And that was a lesson he hadn't expected to find. As McAllister spent more time with Maria, he found himself reconsidering the broader impact of his work. He had always thought of justice in a traditional sense, following the law, upholding order, and ensuring fairness as the rules dictated. But what Maria's work demonstrated was that fairness wasn't always about the rules. It was about the people behind the rules, the systems in place, and how they impacted those who were often overlooked. Maria's passion for reshaping the way the country responded to disasters had a ripple effect on McAllister. In their discussions, she frequently pointed out the inequalities in how the justice system operated, how it often failed to protect the most vulnerable. While he had always prided himself on fairness, he realized that sometimes fairness didn't mean the same thing for everyone. People from marginalized communities faced systemic challenges that often went unnoticed, and the structures of power were set up to maintain those disparities. One afternoon, as they sat together discussing ways to integrate equity into disaster response, McAllister felt the weight of his newfound understanding. He was no longer just listening to her. He was absorbing her vision and realizing that, in his own way, he could make a difference too. He had long been content in his role as a judge, interpreting the law from a position of authority. But Maria had shown him that justice was more than just upholding laws. It was about understanding the human beings who were affected by those laws and what those laws were actually doing to their lives. McAllister started to see his role not as one of enforcing order, but as one of engaging in dialogue that would question long-standing systems and, when necessary, challenge them. It became clear to him that, like Maria, he too had a responsibility to address the deeper issues within the system. The law could be a tool for change, but it could also perpetuate harm if it wasn't used thoughtfully. Maria's insights had opened his eyes to the broader scope of his influence as a judge. He began to look at the cases in front of him differently, considering not just the crime or the violation, but the underlying factors that led people to court. He thought about the communities that often seemed invisible within the justice system, those who were treated as problems rather than people. Inspired by Maria's commitment to putting people first, McAllister started to make small changes in how he approached his role. He began advocating for programs that would help reintegrate individuals into society, prioritizing restorative justice practices over punitive measures. Meanwhile, Maria continued her work with even more focus as her influence grew in the federal government. Yet the bond between her and McAllister remained, grounded in their shared commitment to justice. Though they came from different worlds, one a judge in a courtroom, the other a leader in disaster management, they had both come to understand that real change was possible only when systems were reimagined to truly serve everyone. The work wasn't easy, but together, they felt hopeful about the future. Months passed, and Maria's work continued to garner attention. Her federal disaster management initiative was gaining momentum, with pilot programs launching in several states. Her approach, focused on inclusion, equity, and anticipating the needs of underserved communities, was beginning to reshape the way the government responded to disasters. What had once been a challenging uphill battle was now a powerful movement that attracted both public and governmental support. In the meantime, McAllister had undergone a quiet transformation. He had started incorporating what he had learned from Maria into his judicial practice. His courtroom, once a place of rigid procedure, had become a space for more thoughtful, compassionate engagement. He began exploring restorative justice programs that would offer opportunities for rehabilitation and growth, rather than focusing solely on punishment. His sentences, while still firm, now took into account the circumstances of each individual, asking how the law could serve the person, not just the state. Though their paths were still distinct, Maria and McAllister found ways to support each other's work. They began collaborating more closely on initiatives that bridged the gap between public administration and the justice system, particularly in the realm of disaster preparedness and relief. Maria's research into equitable relief systems often intersected with McAllister's new approach to criminal justice reform. Together, they began advocating for better disaster recovery programs for communities of color who historically faced greater barriers to accessing aid. At a major conference on disaster management and public policy, Maria was invited to speak about her groundbreaking work. As she took the stage, she was introduced by McAllister, who now had a deep respect for her ability to not only transform systems, but also to inspire change in others. It was a moment of validation for Maria, a recognition not just of her work, but of the unexpected partnership that had emerged from a seemingly trivial moment in court. During her speech, Maria paused to acknowledge the people who had supported her journey, the mentors, colleagues, and even those who had once doubted her. But it was her next words that lingered with everyone in the room. True change comes from collaboration, from understanding that the fight for justice isn't a solitary one. It's about listening, learning, and most importantly, acting in ways that honor the humanity of those who are most in need. The crowd erupted in applause. McAllister, sitting in the audience, felt a sense of pride that went beyond his personal journey. He realized that in a small way, he had contributed to this transformation. His initial mistake in court had opened a door to something far bigger, a partnership that had helped reshape not just their individual work, but also the systems they were both striving to improve. As the conference ended, McAllister and Maria stood side by side, looking out at the room full of changemakers. They knew their work wasn't finished, but together, they had taken a meaningful step forward. It wasn't just about the fine or the court case anymore. It was about a shared legacy of justice, equity, and hope.